The summer sun baked the perfectly manicured lawns of Maple Creek Estates, a neighborhood governed with an iron fist by its homeowners association. Every hedge was clipped at the same height, every mailbox painted the same color, every driveway swept to spotless perfection. At least that was how the HOA wanted things to appear. Their board, led by a self-righteous president, prided themselves on keeping the community pristine, no matter the cost to residents. Across the neighborhood, one home stood out, not because it was messy, but because it was unique. Set back on a larger piece of land, the property was shaded by towering oak trees, with a small workshop at the back and an old wrought iron gate that creaked when it swung open. The man who lived there was quiet, private, and rarely seen at HOA meetings. His name was Marcus Reed, and though he kept his yard tidy and his home in good repair, the HOA viewed his independence as defiance. It started with letters, cold, bureaucratic notices slipped into his mailbox. They claimed his workshop violated aesthetic standards and that his gate wasn't an approved design. Then came accusations that his driveway wasn't pressure-washed frequently enough, even though it was spotless. The HOA escalated quickly, adding fines for supposed unapproved landscaping, excessive foliage, and even failure to display proper trash bins. The total quickly ballooned to staggering numbers. When Marcus didn't respond immediately, perhaps assuming it was all a mistake, the HOA turned hostile. Certified letters arrived, threatening liens on his home. By autumn, the fines had climbed to an absurd $250,000. The board called him a problem homeowner, whispering that he thought he was above their rules. They didn't realize how true and how ironic that statement would turn out to be. Neighbors began to notice the tension. HOA board members strutted through the streets with clipboards, documenting supposed violations, smirking as if they'd already won. To them, Marcus Reed was just another resident to crush under paperwork and penalties. They imagined him panicking, scraping together money to pay off their outrageous demands, or else facing foreclosure. But Marcus wasn't panicking. He was planning. What the HOA didn't know, what none of the smug board members even bothered to research, was that Marcus had inherited more than just his home. He had inherited the very land on which Maple Creek Estates was built. Decades ago, long before the HOA was formed, his grandfather had owned hundreds of acres of farmland. When developers came knocking, they struck a deal. The family would lease the land rather than sell it outright. That lease still existed, buried deep in county records, binding every single house in the neighborhood to Marcus's family trust. So while the HOA believed they were tightening the noose around his neck, Marcus knew the rope was firmly in his own hands. He watched them rack up their arrogance, fining him over and over, holding meetings to discuss what to do with that man. He saw the letters grow nastier, the threats bolder, and he said nothing. By winter, the HOA had hired an attorney, preparing to drag Marcus into court. They boasted to neighbors that they'd make an example of him. But when the legal notices landed on Marcus's doorstep, he finally acted. He gathered his records, decades-old contracts, property deeds, and the original lease agreement that proved Maple Creek Estates was built on land his family never sold. Then he called his own lawyer. What came next would turn the HOA's smug smiles into looks of panic. They thought they held power, but they were about to learn they were standing on someone else's ground. Literally. The first blow landed not in a courtroom, but in a simple certified letter. Marcus's attorney sent a formal notice to the HOA, demanding they cease harassment and reminding them, in carefully chosen legal language, that they were technically tenants of the Reed family trust. The HOA board laughed it off at first, dismissing it as bluster. But when their own lawyer dug into the records, panic rippled through the room. The HOA wasn't just overstepping their bounds. They had no real authority over Marcus at all. And worse, their entire community sat on land they didn't even own. The battle lines were drawn. The letter from Marcus's attorney hit the HOA like a thunderclap. At first, they scoffed, telling themselves it was just a desperate bluff. They had power, they had rules, and they believed no single homeowner could stand against their authority. The board members reassured one another that their bylaws were airtight and their lawyer would make quick work of this so-called family trust nonsense. But beneath the forced laughter, there was a current of unease. The HOA president called an emergency meeting in the community clubhouse. Under the glare of fluorescent lights, board members pored over documents and asked themselves questions they'd never considered before. What if Marcus was telling the truth? What if this quiet man they had mocked and fined held the deed to everything they stood on? Their lawyer's preliminary findings only made matters worse. Buried in the county archives was a land lease agreement decades old, signed by Marcus's grandfather and the original developers. But instead of backing down, the HOA doubled down. Pride and arrogance clouded their judgment. They instructed their lawyer to challenge Marcus's claims, insisting that any old lease must have expired or been dissolved when the HOA was formed. They told themselves they couldn't allow one man to undermine their authority. If they gave in now, what message would that send to the rest of the community? Their letters to Marcus grew even nastier. They accused him of forging documents, of lying to intimidate them, of trying to avoid paying the massive $250,000 in fines they'd piled on his shoulders. Neighbors began to whisper about him in hushed tones. Some pitied him, believing the HOA's narrative that he was a troublemaker. Others admired his quiet defiance. But Marcus remained calm, watching the storm build around him with steady resolve. Behind closed doors, he and his lawyer prepared for war. They gathered every scrap of paper, every deed, every tax receipt, every notarized page showing the land lease had never been sold or transferred. While the HOA relied on bluster and threats, Marcus relied on hard facts. And those facts painted an unshakable truth. The neighborhood had no right to dictate anything to him. In fact, their very existence depended on paying annual lease fees to his family trust, though those payments had been quietly folded into development costs long ago and forgotten by almost everyone, except Marcus. As winter deepened, the HOA escalated its tactics even further. They placed a lien on Marcus's home, threatening foreclosure if he didn't pay. They hired private inspectors to photograph every inch of his property, hoping to find violations to justify their fines. They even sent contractors to his gate, demanding he remove it or face further penalties. But Marcus was no longer merely defending himself. He was building a case to dismantle their power entirely. When the HOA tried to take him to court to enforce their fines, Marcus's lawyer filed a counterclaim so devastating it made the board's attorney go pale. The lawsuit argued not only that the HOA had no authority over Marcus, but that they had trespassed, harassed, and fraudulently extorted him while being nothing more than tenants on his family's land. News of the case began to spread through Maple Creek Estates. Homeowners who had once supported the HOA now started questioning its leadership. What if Marcus was right? What if their board had been operating under an illusion of control all these years? A few quietly approached Marcus to apologize, but most remained silent, fearing retaliation from the very people who were supposed to represent them. Still, the board pressed on, too proud to admit defeat. They told themselves that Marcus was just trying to scare them into dropping the fines. But late at night, when the clubhouse stood empty and the neighborhood streets were dark, even the most stubborn board members couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in their stomachs. If Marcus truly owned the land, then everything they built, their rules, their fines, their inflated sense of power, rested on a foundation they didn't control. The first court hearing was scheduled for early spring. In the weeks leading up to it, the HOA president became more erratic. She sent angry emails to every resident, painting Marcus as a dangerous man trying to take over the neighborhood. She promised to protect the community from him, not realizing she was doing exactly the opposite. Marcus never responded publicly. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any speech. It was the calm before a storm no one in Maple Creek Estates had seen coming. By the time the court date arrived, both sides were ready to fight, or so the HOA believed. What they didn't know was that Marcus had more than just legal documents. He had allies, leverage, and a plan to expose their corruption in a way that would leave them powerless forever. As the gavel prepared to fall and the hearing began, the HOA still believed they held the upper hand. But they were about to discover that everything they stood for, every ounce of control they thought they had, belonged to the man they had tried to crush. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing. Maple Creek Estates residents filled the benches, whispering anxiously, curious to see how the battle would unfold. Some were there to support the HOA, fearful that Marcus's claims threatened the very structure of their community. Others were quietly rooting for him, tired of the board's heavy-handed tactics and endless fines. The HOA board members marched in with self-importance, dressed sharply, carrying thick binders filled with their bylaws, inspection reports, and photographs of supposed violations on Marcus's property. They exuded confidence, convinced that the legal system would recognize their authority and bring Marcus to heel. But Marcus arrived with none of the fanfare, just a calm, measured stride and a single folder tucked under his arm. He didn't need theatrics. He had truth and law on his side. From the opening statements, the HOA tried to paint Marcus as a defiant homeowner who refused to follow community rules. They listed every fine, every supposed infraction, portraying him as reckless and unwilling to cooperate. They demanded immediate payment of the $250,000 in penalties, plus legal fees. The board's president nodded smugly as their lawyer spoke, confident that the judge would agree. But when it was Marcus's turn, the atmosphere shifted. His attorney laid out the historical record in meticulous detail. Old deeds, tax receipts, and the original land lease agreement were presented, documents proving that Marcus's family had never sold the ground beneath Maple Creek Estates. The neighborhood, the houses, even the clubhouse itself all stood on land leased from the Reed Family Trust. The HOA's authority over Marcus's property, the attorney argued, was non-existent. In fact, it was the HOA and every homeowner under it who technically owed fees to the trust, not the other way around. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the reality sank in. Residents glanced at one another, stunned. The HOA president shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier confidence faltering as she realized the ground beneath her, both figuratively and literally, was slipping away. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions the HOA's lawyer struggled to answer. Why hadn't the board verified Marcus's claims before escalating fines to such outrageous levels? What gave them the right to place a lien on property they didn't control? The judge ordered both parties to submit additional documentation and scheduled a second hearing, but the damage to the HOA's credibility was already done. Outside the courthouse, word spread quickly. Neighbors who once viewed Marcus as a nuisance now began to see him as a man standing up to bullies. Some even started digging into their own records, realizing the HOA had overcharged them for years, issuing questionable fines and fees with little accountability. Meanwhile, the HOA board convened in emergency sessions, panic setting in. Their attorney warned them that Marcus's counterclaim for harassment and illegal lien placement was strong, and if he pursued it, the board could be personally liable. But pride kept them from backing down. They convinced themselves the judge's questions were just routine. They still clung to the belief that Marcus was bluffing, that some technicality would save them. Marcus, however, wasn't bluffing. Behind the scenes, he was taking steps far beyond the courtroom. He contacted the original developer's successors, verifying every clause of the land lease. He hired surveyors to confirm property boundaries, leaving no room for dispute. He even prepared to send formal notices to each homeowner, informing them of the true nature of their land agreements. The tension in Maple Creek Estates became unbearable. Residents avoided eye contact with HOA board members, uncertain whom to believe. Rumors swirled about what Marcus planned to do if he won. Would he raise lease fees? Would he evict people? Marcus kept silent, letting the board's own fear and arrogance do the work for him. When the second court date arrived, the HOA's confidence was visibly cracked. Their attorney tried to argue that the HOA's authority over homeowners superseded any old land agreements, but the judge wasn't buying it. Marcus's evidence was ironclad. The judge dismissed the HOA's lien against Marcus's property as invalid and signaled that Marcus's counterclaim would move forward. The board members walked out pale-faced, their once proud strides reduced to nervous shuffles. Their control over Marcus had crumbled, and now their entire community governance was at risk. If Marcus pushed forward, they stood to lose not only the case but their positions, reputations, and potentially their own savings. Marcus didn't celebrate publicly. He returned to his quiet home, his iron gate swinging closed behind him. But inside, Preparations were underway for the next phase. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was ready to expose the HOA's abuses, reclaim control of his land, and remind everyone in Maple Creek Estates who truly held power. The board still believed they could regroup, maybe even appeal. They still didn't understand just how deep Marcus's leverage went. But they were about to find out, and their nightmare was only beginning. The courtroom victory was only the first crack in the HOA's armor. While the board tried to regroup, Marcus quietly moved into the next phase of his plan. He wasn't interested in petty revenge. He was interested in ending their reign of harassment permanently. To do that, he had to show the entire neighborhood where real authority came from. Within weeks of the judge dismissing the lien on his home, Marcus sent formal notices to every household in Maple Creek Estates. They weren't hostile or threatening, just factual, clear, and backed by legal documentation. The letters explained that their homes sat on land leased from the Reed family trust, not owned outright. The HOA, which had claimed absolute control, was little more than an administrative committee with no jurisdiction over Marcus or any property tied directly to the trust's terms. The community was stunned. For years, residents had lived under the HOA's constant watch, fined for minor infractions, bullied into compliance, told they had no choice but to obey. Now they learned that the board had been wielding power it didn't even have. Some were furious at Marcus for revealing the truth, but many more turned their anger toward the HOA itself. The board called emergency meetings, urging residents not to fall for Marcus's scare tactics. They claimed his letters were misleading, that his family's land agreements were ancient and irrelevant. But their credibility was crumbling. Homeowners began to ask hard questions. Why hadn't the board verified Marcus's claims before dragging him to court? Why were fines so high, and where had all that money gone? And most importantly, if Marcus wasn't subject to HOA rules, what gave the board the right to impose them on everyone else? Marcus never raised his voice, never appeared on doorsteps demanding loyalty. He let the truth speak for itself. As neighbors compared notes, they realized they'd all been paying questionable fees and suffering under arbitrary rules. One by one, residents began siding with Marcus, quietly offering him support. Meanwhile, Marcus's lawyer sent a second letter to the HOA board, a formal demand to cease all enforcement actions against him and to issue a public apology. The letter also hinted, in careful legal language, that if the harassment continued, Marcus would pursue damages not just against the HOA as an entity but against individual board members personally. This was no idle threat. The court had already signaled sympathy for Marcus's case, and the board knew they were walking on thin ice. As spring turned to summer, the board's arrogance began to unravel. Longtime allies stopped attending meetings. Residents openly questioned decisions. The once smug HOA president found herself facing hostility in her own neighborhood. Contractors who had worked for the HOA refused further jobs, worried about getting caught in legal crossfire. Even the HOA's attorney began urging them to settle before things got worse. But Marcus wasn't finished. Using his ownership rights, he initiated an audit of the land lease terms. The results shocked everyone. For decades, the HOA had failed to pay certain fees owed to the Reed Trust, fees that had been written into the original development agreement but ignored. Marcus now had grounds not only to dismantle their harassment but to demand back payments that could bankrupt the HOA entirely. Word spread fast. Residents who had once feared the HOA's fines now feared its collapse. Some panicked, worried that Marcus might take revenge on everyone. But Marcus reassured them quietly through his actions. He didn't demand more money from individual homeowners. He didn't raise lease rates or threaten evictions. He made it clear his fight was with the abusive board, not with his neighbors. Still, the board fought back, clinging to scraps of power. They filed motions to delay Marcus's claims, issued newsletters painting him as a dangerous agitator, and tried to rally the community against him. But it was too late. Their lies were exposed, and their authority was evaporating. By midsummer, Marcus called for a special meeting, not through the HOA, but through his rights as landowner. He invited every resident to attend. In a packed community hall with neighbors sitting shoulder to shoulder, Marcus calmly laid out the history of the land, the abuses of the HOA, and the legal proof of everything he'd claimed. There were no angry speeches, no gloating, just facts, presented with quiet strength. When he finished, the room erupted, not in outrage at Marcus, but in fury at the board. Homeowners demanded resignations on the spot. Some shouted questions about where their dues had gone. Others demanded refunds for bogus fines. The board president tried to defend herself, but her words were drowned out by the voices of those she'd once controlled. That night marked the true power shift. Marcus didn't have to raise a hand against the HOA. The community itself tore it down. By the end of the week, several board members had resigned in disgrace. The HOA's finances were under investigation. And Marcus, the man they had tried to crush with $250,000 in fines, now held all the leverage. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. With the board collapsing and the neighborhood finally seeing the truth, he prepared for the final step. A legal move that would remove the HOA entirely and return real control to the residents. The same people who once whispered about him as a problem neighbor were now looking to him for leadership. The HOA's arrogance had built the perfect trap for itself, and Marcus was ready to close it for good. The collapse of the Maple Creek Estates HOA began quietly, like a slow leak in a once airtight ship. The courtroom losses, the resignations, and the growing outrage of homeowners had weakened the board beyond repair. But Marcus Reed was not content with seeing them simply humiliated. He was determined to ensure they could never rise again to abuse another neighbor. With his legal team working methodically, Marcus initiated formal proceedings to dissolve the HOA altogether. He used his unique position as landowner to call for an emergency vote among all residents, bypassing the disgraced board entirely. Many were stunned by his boldness, but even more were relieved. After years of living under the HOA's suffocating rule, people were ready for change. The weeks leading up to the vote were tense. The remnants of the board scrambled to rally support, warning residents that without an HOA, property values would plummet and chaos would overtake the neighborhood. They painted Marcus as a dangerous man out for revenge, a landlord who would impose even worse conditions than the HOA ever had. But their words no longer carried weight. The community remembered the fake fines, the harassment, the arrogance, and the image of Marcus calmly proving his case in court silenced most doubts. Marcus continued to handle everything with quiet precision. He sent clear, carefully written letters explaining that his fight was against corruption, not against his neighbors. He promised no rent hikes, no retaliation, no sudden eviction notices. His only goal was to remove an organization that had overstepped its authority and restore peace to the community. When the day of the vote arrived, residents packed the community hall once again. This time, there was no shouting match between Marcus and the board. The shouting came from neighbors themselves, demanding accountability, demanding change, demanding an end to years of petty tyranny. Ballots were cast, counted under watchful eyes, and when the results were read aloud, the decision was overwhelming. Maple Creek Estates would no longer have an HOA. The few remaining board members walked out of the hall in silence, stripped of their power and humiliated before the very people they once ruled. Some faced the prospect of personal lawsuits as Marcus pursued damages for the harassment and fraudulent lien they had filed against him. Others simply vanished from public view, hoping the storm would pass. But for Marcus, the work was not over. He immediately began setting up a new system of voluntary neighborhood management, transparent, simple, and free of the endless fines and micromanagement that had plagued residents for years. Without an HOA siphoning off money, the community's finances stabilized quickly. Contractors were hired directly by homeowners instead of through overpriced HOA deals. Rules were replaced by basic agreements rooted in respect, not intimidation. Marcus also used his position as landowner to protect the neighborhood from future abuse. He added clear provisions to the land lease specifying that no future association could impose arbitrary penalties or threaten residents without unanimous approval. This wasn't about consolidating his power, it was about preventing anyone else from abusing theirs. For the first time in years, people in Maple Creek Estates could breathe freely. Yards filled with children playing instead of inspectors taking photographs. Homeowners painted their mailboxes whatever color they liked. The towering oak trees around Marcus's property swayed in the wind, a quiet reminder of how much had changed. Yet, even as peace settled over the community, the fallen HOA president still seethed in private. Humiliated, facing the possibility of paying damages out of her own pocket, she vowed revenge. But she had no allies left, no legal standing, and no platform to fight from. Marcus had not only defeated her, he had erased the very foundation of her power. The story of Maple Creek Estates began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets covered the dramatic courtroom battle and the shocking revelation of Marcus's land ownership. Online, people marveled at how a single man had taken on an entire HOA and won. To many, Marcus became a quiet hero, proof that standing your ground with truth and patience could topple even the most arrogant oppressors. But Marcus wasn't interested in fame. He remained the same reserved man he had always been, tending his property, helping neighbors when asked, and keeping to himself. His victory wasn't about personal glory. It was about justice, about making sure no one else in his community would suffer the same harassment he had endured. As summer came to an end, Marcus reviewed the last few legal documents needed to finalize the dissolution of the HOA. The neighborhood that had once tried to crush him with $250,000 in fines was now free of its own chains. The same people who had once whispered against him now greeted him warmly when they passed his gate. Some even stopped to thank him outright. Still, Marcus knew the fight wasn't quite finished. The court had yet to decide how much the former HOA leaders would pay in damages for their abuse of power. And Marcus had one last move to make. A final, decisive action that would ensure no future board, no matter how ambitious, would ever try to bully him or his neighbors again. The man they had underestimated, the man they thought they could bankrupt and control, was now in complete command. And soon, the entire state would know that Maple Creek Estates belonged not to an HOA, but to Marcus Reed. The courtroom air hung heavy with anticipation, the faint hum of whispered speculation filling the space. For months, the HOA had paraded its arrogance, boasting of crushing fines and airtight lawsuits against a single man they believed powerless. But now, everything they thought they knew was about to unravel. The HOA president sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, papers neatly stacked like weapons in a war she thought she had already won. Around her sat board members, still confident, still dripping with smugness. They believed they were minutes away from victory, ready to force the man they despised to either pay up or lose everything. Across the aisle, the black landowner appeared calm, his expression unreadable. Unlike the HOA, he didn't bring a mountain of documents or a team of attorneys trying to intimidate through volume. He simply brought proof of ownership, proof of every shady action the HOA had taken, and proof of who truly controlled this neighborhood. When the judge entered, the room went silent. What followed was not the drawn-out trial the HOA expected. It was an unmasking. The man's legal team presented a single, devastating deed. It showed, in clear and irrefutable language, that the entire subdivision, every road, every sidewalk, every parcel beneath the pristine lawns and power-tripping houses, sat on land he owned outright. The HOA had no authority to fine him. In fact, by existing on his land without properly structured agreements, they were the ones violating his rights. Shock spread across the courtroom. The HOA president's face drained of color, her once flawless composure cracking in real time. Board members whispered frantically, trying to salvage a plan. But there was no plan. They had spent months throwing threats at the very man who held their entire neighborhood in the palm of his hand. The judge didn't even take the matter under advisement. The bogus fines were dismissed on the spot. Every lawsuit filed by the HOA collapsed instantly, and the tables turned so completely that even seasoned court reporters struggled to keep pace. With his ownership now confirmed in the most public way possible, the man did not stop there. He filed countersuits for harassment, defamation, and malicious prosecution. He demanded reimbursement for legal fees, and he sought damages for the stress and harm the HOA had caused. The once feared HOA quickly realized they were not just losing their case, they were losing everything. In the weeks that followed, the HOA president resigned under pressure. Board members quit to avoid personal liability. The HOA itself dissolved, unable to function without funding, authority, or credibility. Homeowners, who had once cheered on the board's heavy-handed tactics, suddenly found themselves pleading with the man for leniency. And how did he respond? Not with petty revenge. Not with the kind of cruelty they had shown him. He restructured the neighborhood's management, removing useless fees and absurd restrictions. He placed clear rules in place, fair, reasonable, and focused on maintaining peace, not power. But he never forgot. The man made sure that those who orchestrated the campaign against him faced personal consequences. Through his lawsuits, their bank accounts, reputations, and careers were shaken. No more anonymous threats. No more hiding behind the HOA's shield. Each one of them was held accountable, name by name. The story spread far beyond the neighborhood. News outlets picked it up, online forums exploded with praise, and videos chronicling the HOA's spectacular downfall went viral. The man who had been labeled a rule breaker became a symbol of standing up to unchecked authority. And the HOA became a warning to every other petty board drunk on power. Be careful who you cross, because you never know who truly owns the ground you're standing on. In the end, the landowner didn't just win, he changed the entire community. Streets once patrolled by power-hungry neighbors became quiet and peaceful. Homeowners finally understood what living without intimidation felt like. And the man who had endured months of harassment now walked those same streets freely, no longer a target, but a respected figure. The HOA tried to crush him with $250,000 in bogus fines. Instead, they handed him the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth. They thought they could take his home. He showed them he owned theirs. And with that, the battle was over. The neighborhood was his. Justice had been served. And the memory of the HOA's arrogance would haunt every last person who once believed they could destroy him. 1.